Hello, and welcome back to Snack Time English. I'm Otis, and today we're diving into a topic we all struggle with at some point. Why is it so hard to build good habits and so easy to fall into bad ones? Maybe you've tried to wake up earlier, study every day, or eat healthier, and yet somehow, scrolling on your phone or skipping that workout always feels easier. In this episode, I invited two of my friends, Caleb and Nina, to share their thoughts, experiences, and personal struggles with habits. They're not experts. They're just thoughtful people, like you and me, trying to understand how habits work and how we can stick with the ones that matter. Let's listen in.
You know, it's really interesting to think about how much our daily lives are actually governed by habits, those automatic behaviors that we just do without even really thinking about it. But when it comes to the habits we want to change, say, trying to quit smoking or cut down on sugar, why does it feel like those are the ones that have such a ridiculously strong grip on us?
It's a great question, and it's something that I think a lot of people really struggle with, that sense of like, why am I stuck in this loop?
Right. Why is it so hard to break free from those patterns, especially when we know they might not be serving us well? So today I thought it would be fascinating to dive into the actual science behind how habits form, what makes those unwanted ones so persistent, so sticky, basically, and most importantly, to explore some really concrete strategies for actually making those changes that we want to see.
Yeah, totally. I think a lot of times people think about habits as being purely a matter of willpower or self-discipline, but there's actually a lot more going on beneath the surface in the brain itself.
Exactly. And getting a handle on that science can be super empowering because it gives you a better understanding of why you might be finding it tough to shift those behaviors. And that's what we're going to explore today.
For this deep dive, we've got a really great mix of sources. We've looked at some scientific articles from the NIH, that's the National Institutes of Health, for anyone not familiar, specifically from their News in Health publication, which does a great job of making complex research accessible.
Nice. And I know we also have some insights from psychology today, which always has a ton of interesting stuff on human behavior, of course.
Right. Plus, we've got a collection of expert opinions compiled by Consensus. That's a platform that brings together different perspectives on various topics to give us a more well-rounded view of the complexities involved in both forming and breaking habits. And just to add that practical, real-world angle, we'll be weaving in some advice from a preventive cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic.
Awesome. So where do we even begin with this whole habit thing?
Well, let's start with the basics. Just how deeply ingrained our habits can be. I mean, think about your morning routine. Are you consciously going through each step of, like, showering or brushing your teeth?
Honestly, probably not. I'm usually half asleep still. My body just seems to know what to do.
Exactly. And that's what researchers like Dr. Nora Volkow from the NIH and Dr. Russell Poldrack at the University of Texas at Austin point to. Many of our daily actions are actually these super efficient, almost automatic routines that our brains have just learned to execute without much conscious effort.
Now, it's like our brain has this whole library of pre-programmed sequences.
Yeah, kind of. And it's not just limited to like morning routines or hygiene stuff. Dr. Volkow also uses the example of driving familiar routes. You can be totally lost in thought listening to a podcast or whatever, and suddenly you're at your destination without really registering every turn.
Oh, I do that all the time,
Yeah.
especially when I'm on autopilot.
Yeah. And the Mayo Clinic expert we looked at also points out that a huge chunk of our daily actions actually fall into this automatic category.
So our brains are basically wired for efficiency, always trying to streamline things.
Exactly. Dr. Volkow explains that when a behavior becomes a habit, our brain essentially goes, okay, we've got this figured out. No need to waste precious energy on thinking through every single step. It frees up mental resources and conserves energy, which is a huge advantage because, let's face it, our brains use a lot of energy.
That makes total sense. It's like the brain's way of saying, hey, I've got bigger fish to fry than figuring out how to brush your teeth for the millionth time.
Right. But here's the catch. Sometimes that autopilot mode can lead us down paths that we no longer want to be on.
Like that late night snacking habit that I just can't seem to shake.
Yeah.
Or, yeah, those bigger challenges like struggling with addiction.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the really powerful role of reward, and specifically a neurochemical called dopamine and habit formation.
So we all know that certain things feel good. That's basic human nature. But what's actually happening in the brain when we experience that pleasure?
The NIH News and Health article breaks it down like this. When we experience something enjoyable, our brain's reward centers light up. And this is where those, let's say, less desirable habits can really take root.
Because that initial pleasure creates a strong connection in the brain, like do that again.
Exactly. And Dr. Poldrack dives even deeper into the role of dopamine. He explains that dopamine isn't just about signaling pleasure, it's also key for reinforcing those pleasure-based habits and creating those intense cravings that we can experience. It's basically that little voice in your brain saying, more, please.
He actually gave this really interesting example. He talked about how drug cravings can persist even when the drug itself no longer produces the same level of pleasure. It's like the brain is still chasing that initial dopamine hit, even if the reality isn't as enjoyable anymore.
Yeah, that's a really powerful example of just how strong that dopamine-driven motivation can be. And it really highlights why breaking those bad habits can be so tough. You're not just fighting a conscious decision, you're basically battling those deeply ingrained reward pathways in your brain.
Which explains why it often feels like those unwanted habits are practically hardwired into us.
Totally. Dr. Volko actually used that term, hardwired. And it's easy to feel kind of powerless when you think about your brain working against you.
Right. Like, what chance do I have?
But here's the encouraging part. The NIH article emphasizes that we're not just puppets to our habits. We have other parts of our brain that can step in and exert some control.
Enter willpower.
Exactly. And Dr. Roy Baumeister, he's done a ton of research on this. He talks about willpower being like a muscle.
Okay, I've heard that analogy before, but I'm not sure I fully get it.
Well, just like a physical muscle, willpower can get tired after being used a lot. So if you've already exerted a ton of mental energy resisting one temptation, you might be more likely to give in to the next one that comes along.
Oh, that explains so much. Like,
Yeah.
after a crazy day of work, all my best intentions go out the window when I see that box of cookies.
Right. But here's the good news about the muscle analogy. Just like you can strengthen your biceps with regular exercise, research suggests that willpower can also be strengthened through practice.
So even if I feel like I have zero willpower right now, I can actually build it up over time.
Exactly. Even small acts of self-control throughout your day, like opting for a healthier snack or resisting the urge to check social media every 5 seconds, those can actually contribute to building that willpower muscle over time.
So it's not some fixed trait that you're just stuck with. That's good to know.
Definitely. And this is where the human factor comes in. Dr. Baumeister has also highlighted that we humans are actually much better at orienting our behavior towards long-term goals compared to other animals.
Oh, that's interesting. So we're not just slaves to immediate gratification.
Not necessarily. We have this capacity to envision a future that we want and make choices that align with that vision, even if it means delaying immediate pleasure. And that brings us to a question that I think a lot of people ponder. Is it really harder to break a bad habit than it is to form a good one?
Oh, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Mm-mm.
I know, I've definitely wondered that. It always feels way easier to fall back into those old, comfortable patterns than to establish new, healthier ones.
Yeah, it's a common experience. And to get some answers, we turn to those expert opinions compiled by consensus. And what they suggest is that, as with most things in life, it's not a simple black and white answer.
Okay, so no easy answers then.
Right. Benjamin Gardner, a researcher at King's College London, makes this really important point. Habit itself isn't just this on or off switch. Habits actually exist on a spectrum of strength.
So a habit that I've only done a handful of times isn't going to have the same hold on me as something I've been doing for years and years.
Exactly. And Gardner also points out that there are a few different ways you can approach tackling a habit you want to change. You can try to avoid the triggers that set the habit in motion in the first place, like if seeing a certain commercial always makes you crave a specific snack, maybe you switch channels during those commercial breaks.
So it's about being strategic and kind of outsmarting your triggers.
Right. And you can also try to directly stop the behavior itself when you encounter a trigger. It's that whole just say no approach. Or you can attempt to unlearn the underlying associations that have been built up around the habit.
Unlearn. How does that work?
Well, Gardner suggests that it often involves creating new competing associations. So let's say every afternoon you have a habit of getting a sugary soda with your lunch. You could try consciously replacing that with a glass of water each day.
So you're basically rewiring your brain to associate lunchtime with water instead of soda.
Yeah, exactly. But as you can imagine, the difficulty of each of these approaches can be really different depending on the specific habit and the individual.
And as we talked about with willpower, sometimes just telling yourself don't do it isn't enough, especially when you're feeling stressed, tired, or overwhelmed.
Absolutely. And here's another key factor that a few of the consensus experts pointed out, including Rachel Smith, she's a health psychologist, and Benjamin Gardner again. A lot of bad habits actually provide this more immediate sense of pleasure or reward compared to good habits.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Like that immediate sugar rush from a donut versus the, I don't know, the long-term benefits of eating a salad.
Right. And because of that instant gratification, those bad habits can be that much harder to shake. The reward is right there, front and center.
Whereas with good habits, like exercising regularly or sticking to a healthy diet, those positive results might not be noticeable for weeks or even months.
Exactly. And that delay can make it really tough to stay motivated. Now, another interesting point that Miriam Siebold, a researcher at Charity Universitätsmedizin Berlin, brought up is that our brains are actually wired to love repetition. Those neural pathways responsible for habits, they're evolutionarily ancient and super efficient.
So our brains are kind of hardwired to favor those well-trodden paths.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. It takes less effort for the brain to stick to those familiar routines. Two other researchers, Klaus Rothermund and Una van der Leyen, also suggested that while forming new habits can happen more automatically through repetition, breaking those really ingrained ones actually requires more conscious effort and control.
It's almost like you have to consciously override your brain's natural tendency to go down that familiar, well-worn path.
That's a great way to put it. And Gina Cleo, another expert who contributed to consensus, also emphasized how important it is to have that conscious control, strong motivation, and good self-regulation to actually break those automatic responses that are characteristic of habits.
So it's not enough to just passively wish for things to change. You have to be actively engaged in that process.
Exactly. So knowing all of this, that habits are deeply rooted in our brain's structure and function, what can we actually do to make those changes that we're aiming for? What are some practical steps?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? It's all well and good to understand the science, but how do we actually put it into practice?
Well, Dr. Volko from the NIH stresses that the first step is becoming truly aware of your own unhealthy habits. It might sound obvious, but a lot of times we're just kind of on autopilot, not really paying attention to those patterns that are playing out.
So it's like that saying, awareness is the first step to change.
Right. Once you have that awareness, then you can start developing strategies to counter those habits. And as we mentioned earlier, one of the most basic but effective strategies is avoiding those tempting situations altogether. Both the NIH News and Health article and Benjamin Gardner highlighted that.
So if you know that a certain environment or a certain cue always triggers a particular habit, try to minimize your exposure to it as much as possible.
Exactly. If your usual route home takes you past your favorite fast food joint, maybe find a different way to go. Or if you tend to mindlessly snack while you watch TV, maybe try doing something else during that time to break that association.
Makes sense. And I know Dr. Poldrack and the NIH also talk about the power of mentally practicing those desired behaviors in those tempting situations.
Yeah, it's all about visualization. By picturing yourself successfully navigating a challenging situation and choosing the healthy behavior, you're basically strengthening those neural pathways for that new response.
So it's like giving your brain a sneak peek of what success looks like and making it more likely to choose that path in the real world.
Exactly. You're essentially priming your brain for success. Another strategy that we came across was actively replacing those unhealthy routines with new, healthier ones. Dr. Volko even mentioned cases of people who've managed to replace really severe addictions with incredibly intense activities like marathon running.
Wow, so it's like channeling that habitual energy into a totally different outlet.
Yeah, it's finding something that, for you, provides a sense of satisfaction or engagement that can kind of compete with that old habit. But of course, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right, what works for one person might not work for someone else.
Totally. And it's important to remember that, as Dr. Poldrack reminds us, replacing a habit doesn't just magically erase those old neural pathways. It's more about strengthening the new ones and actively suppressing that original response. So the urge for that old habit might still pop up sometimes, but the new, healthier one becomes stronger and more automatic over time.
Got it. So it's a process, and consistency is key.
Absolutely. And psychology today really emphasizes that immediate reinforcement is super important for building new habits, especially those positive ones. They point out that, as we discussed earlier, those bad habits tend to have that built-in immediate reward.
Yeah, that instant gratification can be really hard to resist.
Right. So to tip the scales in your favor, they suggest actually creating your own immediate positive consequences for those good habits, like choosing activities you genuinely enjoy, adding a social element to make it more fun, bringing in some novelty to keep things fresh, tracking your progress to see those tangible results, and rewarding yourself for even those small wins along the way.
That makes sense. If I know there's a little reward waiting for me after I do something good for myself, I'm way more likely to stick with it.
Exactly. And they also talk about the power of internal reinforcers, things like positive self-talk and visualization. Like how athletes will often mentally rehearse their performance before a big game.
Yeah, I've heard that can be incredibly effective for building confidence and focus.
Right. So it's about consciously shifting your internal dialogue from that self-criticism to encouragement and focusing on the positive aspects of the changes you're making. And I think the advice from the Mayo Clinic expert we looked at really ties everything together nicely. He basically said that habits are never really truly forgotten.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not about completely erasing the old habit.
It's more about focusing on replacing it with very small, manageable, healthy changes that you can consistently reinforce.
Okay, so taking a step back to summarize all this amazing info, habits, whether we love them or hate them, become deeply ingrained in our brains because our brains are all about efficiency and responding to rewards.
Right. And breaking those unwanted habits can feel extra challenging because those patterns often become automatic, tied to our brain's reward system.
And on the flip side, forming new positive habits can sometimes feel like a constant uphill battle because those rewards often take a while to show up.
But, and this is the key takeaway, lasting change is absolutely possible. By understanding how your brain works and using those insights to your advantage, you can create new, healthier patterns.
It's not about some magical willpower fairy dust. It's about understanding the science and being strategic about it.
Exactly. So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Think about just one small habit you've been wanting to change. Now, considering everything we've talked about today, the role of your motivation, your environment, and that powerful immediate reward, what's one tiny, immediately rewarding step you could take today towards building that new, healthier routine?
It's all about starting small, being consistent, and making it rewarding for yourself. That's the recipe for real, lasting change.
That was Caleb and Nina sharing some honest thoughts about habits, the ones that lift us up and the ones that quietly hold us back. And maybe that's the takeaway today. Habits aren't about being perfect. They're about coming back over and over again. So whether you're starting small, starting over, or just thinking about starting, you're doing more than you think. Thanks for listening to Snack Time English. I'll see you next time. And until then, take care of your words, your time, and yourself.